This is Hypnotic Stories, Episode 10, titled, Life is a Yoga Class.
Hypnotic Stories is your treasure trove of hypnotic storytelling for change work and self-improvement. Here is your host, Master Storyteller James Hazlerig.
You know, in a previous life, I was a college writing instructor. I taught freshman college English, known as freshman composition, and I found that students would either be frustrated or happy with what kind of assignment I gave them for writing. And you'd think that the more restrictive something is, the less people would like it, but the opposite proved to be true. If I said, write 500 words about anything, man, that was just the hardest assignment ever, because how do you figure out what to say? Whereas if I said, write 500 words about why turnips shouldn't be served in the cafeteria, boom. That was relatively easy to do. Today, I have two stories for you, and they're both about the benefits of constraint, if you think about it that way. They're both about taking on challenges and learning from them. The first story is our title story, Life is a Yoga Class, and you'll figure that out as you go along. The second one is actually a story that I created for the Facebook group Original 2-Minute Stories, hosted by Doug O'Brien and Nick Kemp, who are both well-known storytellers. And they've asked people to create stories that are 2 minutes or less. And it's a really fascinating challenge. And so I'm planning to do more, but I created this story that you're going to hear in the later part of the podcast. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. So at one point, a client came to me, and she was one of those wonderful clients who decided to simply visit my office once a month because she loved how hypnosis felt and she liked improving her life. I really admired her because she was one of the people that I thought really cultivated Zen. She cultivated a peaceful attitude and a very positive attitude toward life. She came in to my office, and recent events had her somewhat distraught. She was saying, how can I, in the face of these events, maintain that peace that I've had? How can I go on thinking positive thoughts in the face of what's happening? And, you know, in a lot of ways, that's the question, the age-old question that philosophers and religious people have asked forever, the question of how can a benevolent God let bad things happen to good people? Honestly, no one really has a good answer. But knowing that my client often finds peace in yoga, I said, you know, sometimes I think life is a yoga class. And she said, what on earth do you mean? And I said, you know, you go to a yoga class and everything's fine. You're walking along upright. You're comfortable. And then you go into this class and you, under the direction of someone else, essentially in a situation you don't really control, you put yourself in a very uncomfortable pose. And then you breathe. You breathe deeply. You focus on your breath, letting go of that discomfort until you have breathed through it. You know, at one point, I interviewed a number of golf professionals. I was hoping to become the go-to hypnosis guy for the local golfers. It never really quite panned out, but I did get to interview quite a few golf pros and talk to them about the mental game. And what I learned then was that golf is not what I had thought it was, because for a long time I thought that golf was simply a good walk ruined. Then I found out at one point when I was associating with someone I knew who golfed, I found out that golf is several hours of being away from his wife and kids. That's what golf was for him. But talking to the golf pros, I realized golf is yoga for rich white guys. Because in yoga, you put yourself in a difficult situation and then you focus on one thing and let everything else fall away. You enter a Zen state. Golf is the same thing. All that matters is the hole and the ball. The water feature, it doesn't matter. The sand trap, it doesn't matter. The trees don't matter. And yet, so many golfers have the problem that they stare at what they don't want. They look at the water and they think, oh, don't go in the water. And they picture the ball going into the water. And where does the ball end up going? Into the water. Now, golf would be much easier if there wasn't a water hazard, if there wasn't a sand trap. But there wouldn't be enough challenge to it. So yogis learn it one way, golfers learn it another. And I've read that the Shivayas of India, these are the mystics who serve Shiva, who is called the destroyer, though Shiva means the good one, the nice guy. The Shivayas were noted for meditating in a charnel yard. That means a place where bodies were burned, and the ash of bodies covered all over that place. And what they said is that if you could build your altar out of a skull and bones and meditate while covered in the ash of dead bodies, if you could find God within in that moment, you were truly meditating. Now, the Vishnayas, those who serve Vishnu, the preserver, they went to beautiful temples. They went to lovely places and sat in beautiful gardens to meditate. And the Shivayas just said, yeah, anybody can find God in a garden. The challenge is to find God when God is not obvious. Which reminds me a little bit of the first office I had when I first started out as a hypnotist. Now, I had a shoestring budget. If shoestrings had shoestrings, that was the budget I was on. And yet I found a little building in an old antique mall that had sort of been repurposed, and there were some kind of holistic shops in there. And it was out in the middle of nowhere in Bastrop County, Texas, where I live, and lived then, still live today. About a month after I opened my office, now I'd spent a month or two just remodeling it, getting it ready to go, and then I launched it. It had a fantastic month, and then a fire came through. And the fire burned down everything except my office, one of the buildings next to it, and another building kind of in the back. Now, the folks who own the rock shop in the building next to mine, they said, we were ready to retire. Let's get out of here. And they bugged out. The folks who had that other building near the back were spiritual healers. They did Reiki and angel readings and things like that. They left as well. And when they left, they said, how can we do healing in the middle of all of this devastation? To which I replied, where else do you do healing but in the middle of devastation? And so that was the uncomfortable position that my yoga teacher of life put me in, to find the peace in the middle of that devastation. Now, sometimes we like to believe that we get doled out rewards for being good, and yet we see that's obviously not often how the world works. Sometimes really bad things happen to good people, and I'm reminded of how when I was learning to play the violin, I would work on an exercise until I had it mastered, and then my teacher would flip the page, and I'd be expected to do things I'd never done before, and to find the beautiful tone, even with these other greater challenges. And my violin teacher kept giving me harder and harder things to do. And at one point I complained. I said, this is really difficult. And she looked at me and she said, do you know about the moon landing? And I said, well, yeah, I've watched the video I know. And she said, do you know what John F. Kennedy said? He said, we go there not because it is easy but because it is hard. And that's when I reflected on a movie that I saw once called A League of Their Own, in which one of the baseball players complains that what she's being asked to do is too difficult, too hard, and the coach, played by Tom Hanks, says, of course it's hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. It's the hard that makes it great. And so life is kind of like a yoga class. When you've mastered certain poses, your instructor gives you more difficult ones, more advanced poses, and challenges you to find peace in those. And the teacher is not doing this to be cruel, nor is it a punishment because you haven't done well. But rather, it's a challenge presented to you to teach you, to see if you can rise to that occasion. Because, a ship is completely safe when it's sitting in a harbor. And yet that's not what ships are for. Ships are meant to go out and brave the depths. And I suspect that many a time sailors have been caught in the middle of a storm. And that's the moment in which they find out the quality of their captain and the quality of their ship and the quality of the crew. And I suspect in those moments when it seems as though the entire world is conspiring to destroy them, that is the moment in which their captain, like a Shakespearean king, says, "Fear not, for we are in God's hands, brother, not the hands of the storm." And that reminds me a lot of how several years ago I walked on a fire. Now, not a literal fire. It was actually hot coals spread out there. And it was a whole fire walking thing that we went to. They talked to us a lot about science and about mysticism, and they got us all ramped up into really excited states where we were yelling and laughing and ecstatic, and then had us walk out barefoot through some very, very wet grass, and then walk along the fire. Some of you listening were there and remember this. And I have to say that I knew scientifically that if this was done right, my feet would not burn. And yet every instinct I had was saying, get off of this fire, leave it now, give up, step onto the wet grass. And truthfully, I could have walked across the wet grass. I would have made just as much distance. But I walked on the fire not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And at the end, I felt such a state of triumph, knowing that I had passed through the fire and come out purified, refined, in a blissful, ecstatic state, kind of like the one that many people reach when they've been in a yoga class and it's been difficult and it has had artificial challenges. Nobody really moves into those positions, and yet, at the end, you know what you are made of. And sometimes the challenges in life, we look at it and we say, oh, not another learning experience, and yet, that's what we need. And so perhaps the Almighty or the universe is not always simply Santa Claus rewarding you for being good or punishing you for being bad. Sometimes life is a yoga teacher giving you challenges so that you can find out what you're truly made of. I know there were times when she looked more beautiful than she did that day, and yet that moment is etched in my memory. She looked more beautiful the first time that I asked her out, and she said yes. She looked more beautiful that day when we covered her hair in flowers that we had picked on the banks of Lake Erie. And she looked so beautiful in that blue prom dress that contrasted with her albino white skin and hair and brought out the anomalous blue in her eyes. And yet, that moment haunts me. When I looked out through the sickly green tint of a Greyhound bus window and could see the bus worker loading my possessions, one suitcase, a fiddle, the same one that my grandparents had given to my mother when she went off to college, and an old IBM Selectric typewriter, the same one that my mother had used when she typed up the final copy of my father's dissertation. And my parents were there, waving as the bus slowly lurched into motion, my mother looking worried, my father looking very proud. But mostly I remember seeing her in blue jeans and a red and black sweatshirt, the same one she wore when I first kissed her, leaning against the red brick wall of the Greyhound station, her blue eyes downcast, not watching, not even looking up, as the bus slowly pulled out of the town where she and I grew up and put me on the road to the life that I would live without her. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed both of those stories. By the way, I sent a copy of that second one to my high school sweetheart. We're still friends on Facebook, and she liked it quite a bit. Didn't consider it to be nearly as sad a story as many other people who've listened to it considered it to be. So I hope that you'll take that challenge of creating a 2-minute story just to hone your skills, and I hope that you'll keep using hypnotic metaphors in your life and in your work. Until next time, keep telling great stories.
Thanks for listening to the Hypnotic Stories Podcast with James Hazlerig. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. For free storytelling tips, go to www.hypnotic-stories.com.